Hey everyone, I'm Dan Sege from Hydro Ottawa, and I'll be hosting the ThinkEnergy podcast. So here's today's big question. Are you looking to better understand the fast-changing world of energy? Join me every 2 weeks and get a unique perspective from industry leaders as we deep dive and discuss some of the coolest trends, emerging technologies, and latest innovations that drive the energy sector. So stay tuned as we explore some traditional and some quirky facets of this industry. This is the ThinkEnergy podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to the ThinkEnergy podcast. As cities struggle with the pressure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, better support green jobs, and hyper-competitive real estate markets, they must find new and creative solutions that address short and long-term issues. This includes creating a low or zero carbon future, which requires a step-by-step process to retrofit our existing communities and ensure all future builds are net zero carbon operations by 2050. From policy to infrastructure to new and old buildings, how can we create cities that improve lives through deep carbon reductions, creating co-benefits for people and the planet? As of 2018, the green building industry added over 164,000 jobs, which 55% greater than 2014. Over the same period, Canada's oil and gas extraction, mining, and forestry industries stagnated in terms of job growth. They contracted by 2.8% and shed 7,580 positions. Canadians have grown conscious of a broader range of social and environmental challenges. This shift and resulting public pressure have in turn spurred policymakers and industry leaders to raise the bar on sustainability, leading to increased government activity and higher standards for both building codes and industry certifications. As a result, green building certification programs are not only growing increasingly stringent, but also broadening in scope. Over the past decade, they have raised the bar on energy efficiency, renewable energy, and sustainability practices. By extension, they have changed the way Canadians design, construct, maintain, and operate buildings. A large percentage of Canada's buildings continue to be constructed without green building practices or third-party certification. Building codes and municipal bylaws in provinces such as British Columbia are driving market transformation via new construction. So here's today's big question. Is the existing building market remain the most significant untapped opportunity for economic development, job creation, and GHG reduction in Canada? Our guest today leads the Canada Green Building Council National Green Building Strategy, programs, and standards, along with advocacy and policy initiatives. He's also the founding director of the Canada Green Building Council and became president and CEO of the council in 2005. Dear listeners, please welcome Thomas Mueller. Thomas, you're a well-known advocate for green buildings and sustainable community developments. Perhaps you can start by telling us a bit about yourself, what drew you to your current role, and what the Canada Green Building Council does.
Okay, well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Thomas Mueller. I'm the president and CEO of an organization called the Canada Green Building Council. And we've been advocating for green building practices since 2000 and early 2000s, 2005. And we are really focusing on changing the practices in the building industry ever since. What really drew me to this work was that I was inspired at the time, and this is a long time ago now, by Our Common Future, which was the Brundtland Report, as it was referred to, the first mention of sustainable development. And it didn't take me long to realize that the building sector is one of the sectors that there's no other sector in the world has more impact, not just on climate change, but also how we live and our economy than the building sector. So that in the late 1990s, I was drawn to that sector to make changes there that would help us reduce the environmental impact from that sector.
Now, how can we create cities that improve lives through deep carbon reduction, creating co-benefits for people and the planet? Why should we strive to make every building greener?
That's it. So when you look at the building sector or in cities, when we, and it's getting better now, but when we used to cover climate change in this country, usually if you watch CBC or CTV, it was always they were standing in front of a big chimneys that would kind of emit what I guess was carbon emissions, with big factories, or it was transportation, would stand up in front of a highway and just, talk about how these two sectors, transportation and factories, would just be the main culprit in climate change. The fact is they're very high emitters, but actually the building sector in Canada and globally is about 30%. And that includes both the operation of the building, so the heating, cooling, lighting, but it also includes the embodied materials, so the embodied carbon materials. So that includes the energy used to make steel, the energy used to make any part of the building. So it's a significant footprint that the building sector has, and the building sector also employs a lot of people. And we live in those buildings. So it's about the opportunity about carbon reduction, but it's also the opportunity that buildings are made for people. And we want to make sure that we're balancing our environmental aspects, so our environmental aspirations that we have for building in kind of the green building context that would help us to also look at how can buildings be good for people? Because at the end of the day, that's what we build buildings for, to live, to learn, to work. It's this combination of, in the building sector, the impact and also the impact that buildings have on our lives and on the environment. It's a combination of that. And so it's a great opportunity to combine those in green buildings. And also the green building sector is the only one, when you talk about climate change and the other things, is that it actually has a return on investment. And not just from the energy, but you have people in buildings that are more productive, that are healthier, that has a direct impact on, as an employer, for government, if people are healthier, happier, more productive, that has a positive impact all around.
Okay, Thomas, wondering how important is it to balance our carbon reduction ambitions with health considerations, particularly during and after COVID-19? Do we have a clear path to show carbon leadership with healthier indoor environments that future-proof buildings, encourage innovation, and drive job growth?
Yes, we do. So I think we need to, there are several questions here that we need to pick apart a little bit. One is that we absolutely need to balance our ambitions around carbon reduction, energy efficiency with human health and well-being. Because we don't want to go back to the 1970s where we kind of over-insulate buildings and then people get actually sick in those buildings, right? And just as a human being, I think we want to have access to light when we work on those buildings, to daylight in those buildings. We want to have access to fresh air. We want to have access to an environment that makes us feel healthy and relaxed, because then that's when we're at our best. Let's say in a working environment, or in a learning environment at school for our children, or when you're at home. You just want to make sure that the air and the light in your building are healthy. And so we want to make sure that how we design our buildings around carbon, because there's one trend where you want to have super insulated buildings. And don't get me wrong, energy efficiency is very important when we get to low carbon or zero carbon buildings. But at the same time, we want to make sure that not only basic human needs are met, that we want to enhance those needs in buildings. So we need to design them accordingly. So we need to balance those two. Now, COVID has provided an extra kind of layer around and how people think about buildings. Because before then, I think most people didn't really think too much about, ventilation, when they went to work, ventilation or airflow or those types of things. With COVID, that has come really into focus now. How that buildings need to be not only safe, but they should also be healthy. And so I think there's a great opportunity to rethink what buildings can be, not just from an environmental point of view, but also from a health point of view. I think the final solution on how buildings will operate after the pandemic is over, or after the pandemic has kind of retreated, because I think it will be with us for a while, is still out. But definitely what we know is that more fresh air in buildings will be very important. And then there's filtration of that air, and there will be humidification of that air, and so on. So what the final solution is really depends also, where you are, what kind of building it is. That solution is still out. But it's a great opportunity to look at and say, what can buildings now be from a health point of view? And even not just because of COVID, but beyond COVID, because we want healthier buildings, but we also want them to be low carbon. We want them to be water efficient. We want them to be material efficient. We want to recycle. And that's something, as the council, we have been advocating for the last 20 years through our LEED building rating system, which is called Leadership in Energy Environmental Design. We have advocated for that. So what we call that is holistic buildings that are good for the environment, they're good for people, and they're good for the economy. Right? And buildings are actually the only sector where you can actually materialize that, where you can actually realize that you can invest in environmental solutions, you can invest in human-based solutions, and you can have a return on investment. So in a way, you can have your cake, and you can eat it too when it comes to buildings and environment and business. In green buildings is the epitome of that, where this comes together in a very meaningful, in a very outcome-based way.
How do we accelerate to a net zero economy? How can we create efficiencies to reduce environment at risks?
I think there's several factors playing into that, and how we can accelerate that. Is one, first of all, I think we need good government policy. And we see that now with the current federal government, they have actually done more on climate change policy than all the previous governments taken together, as far as I'm concerned. And it's finally good to see that we have made not only policy, but there's also investment, as you've seen in the budget. The last budget's come out, and announcements before that. There's been a real investment, or it's been investments being made in helping the economy and the environment and climate to move towards low and zero carbon. Because I think that the goals are clear now, right? The goals are ambitious, but they're not ambitious in Canada, they're ambitious globally. But this government has really made an effort, and it starts with just before the budget, where Minister McKenna announced I don't know how much money it was, but it was in $1.6 billion for underserved communities, smaller and underserved communities, in terms of retrofit in new buildings, and the building's supposed to be, low or zero carbon. Was an announcement by the Canada Infrastructure Bank, a financing program of $2 billion to finance retrofits in the commercial sector, like large building retrofits. There was announcements in the budget around the workforce development, because we can't forget, we also need to invest in the workforce so that people are skilled, and we have enough people that actually can kind of renovate or retrofit and build those buildings. And then also that investment in Canadian economy, in producers to decarbonize, right? So it's nice to say, you need products that have a lower carbon footprint, but we're talking from extraction to manufacturing to installation to use to disposal. That's a long life cycle, and you need to decarbonize the whole product supply chain in order to get there. So we have that part. So proactive government, and we also see it replicated at provincial level, and we see it replicate at the local level. Many municipalities, as you know, have announced climate emergencies. Great. But now, is always the challenge is not just that you plan and you announce, but what about the implementation? How can you make that happen now? And buildings, again, is a natural go-to because government is the biggest owner of buildings in the country, collectively. The federal government owns a lot of buildings, municipalities and provinces own a lot of buildings. Federal government has announced for its own building that they want to build their buildings to zero carbon by 2030, all their own buildings, that they want to retrofit the existing buildings to low carbon performance, that they only want to lease office space, only lease buildings that in zero carbon buildings by 2030. So they take a lot of steps also as an owner, as a procurer of products and services to go that route. But the second part then is the private sector. We have to get the private sector on board because no matter, you cannot regulate your way out of this. We actually need that the private sector needs to be at the table and actually invest in the low carbon economy. And for us on the building side, we already see that happen. Many of our largest our members in the council, large commercial real estate owners have invested in green buildings in a massive way in their portfolio of buildings. We see governments across the country, federal government, provincial governments, local governments using LEED and other standards that we provide for their own buildings. But the private sector investment is really important, and this whole aspect of, and I'm sure you've been following that, is around sustainable finance. That all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but companies across North America and the globe have realized that climate is a risk, and that if it's left unchecked, it will actually be detrimental to their business. And they have started to shift their investment patterns into the direction that mitigates carbon emissions, but also investments into resiliency, building up the resiliency of the building stock, of their building stock. So you see a real shift that's happening now on the financial side as well. And that's very much business driven. So those two really have to come together. Because if business believes, and I see it happen now, if business believes that climate risk is real, which they do, and they believe that they can actually get a return on their investment by investing in climate solutions, then this can move actually forward very, very quickly, supported by good policy and good regulation to raise the whole ship.
For this question, Thomas, could you share with our listeners examples of how does your council make inroads towards reducing the environmental impact of the built environment?
So we, as the council, so just so everybody understands that, so we consider to be an environmental organization, but we're very much industry-led. So our board and our members represent a cross-section of the green building or the building industry, from designers to owners to manufacturers to investors to developers and so on. And that's by design, because we need all the different the different expertise and knowledge, the different sectors and subsectors at the table. What we do is, and how we started off and what we still do is, we actually set advanced standards for buildings. So LEED is an example of that. Another one is the zero carbon standard that we launched now over 3 years ago. We set advanced standards for buildings that go well beyond the building code. And these standards are set in a way with the industry. So we're working with the leaders in the industry to set those standards, because we want to have standards that work in the industry and that work well in the industry. So the industry feels they can build those buildings to that level, they can invest on those buildings, and it's actually possible. But there is, depending on how far you want to go, there's a considerable amount of stretch in there. So it's not, we're not satisfied with the status quo. So one way is we're setting standards, and then we also, those building owners and developers that use our standards, we actually certify these projects. So we make sure that they're meeting those standards. So we have a verification, quality assurance process to make sure it's being met. And depending on what they achieve, we recognize them publicly for that achievement. In Canada, after the US, Canada is the largest user of LEED in the world. LEED exists now in 200 countries. Canada was the first adopter of LEED. We're currently about 1.5 billion square feet in our LEED program alone. Across the country, coast to coast to coast, any climate, any building type you can imagine is in our program. We have certified close to 5,000 of those buildings now. Setting a new standard for buildings, but in a holistic way. So energy, carbon, water, waste, sites, how we treat the sites, habitat, and then also, of course, as we talked about, human health and transportation as well. So this is one way. And then we're supporting the standards through education. We accredit professionals. We organize events like our national conference every year, and also very specific industry events. Then we also convene leaders in the industry, and we do a considerable amount of effort, activity, advocating with all levels of government and also with the private sector as well, all with the focus to moving the needle forward. So we have a very comprehensive approach on how to move the industry forward, and education in that we train professionals, but we also have the workforce development, as I mentioned before, that we need to train from the trades to the architects in sufficient numbers so we can deliver green building at scale. Scale matters a great deal.
Okay, you've alluded to this a little earlier. With buildings generating almost 30% of Canada's GHG emissions, when construction materials, processes, and operations are considered, why are green buildings an actionable solution for helping Canada meet its global change commitments?
Going back to what I said earlier, no, initially the focus was very much on transportation, and I'm all for transit systems. I take transit every day, and I never drive to work, and obviously the large emitters need to also be targeted. But the fact is that we cannot reach our climate change goals without addressing the building sector. It's not just in Canada. I think it's recognized now globally, particularly over the last 5 years, that buildings play a huge role, and not just new buildings. Again, we can't build our way out of the climate crisis. We need to actually really focus on retrofit, and that includes a large building retrofit. So the council has a substantial program around large building retrofits, so those buildings over 25,000 square feet, that they need to be retrofitted at scale in the thousands, actually. And that's actually mirrored in other jurisdictions. If you go into in the European Union, they dedicated something like, I think it was 230 billion euros to retrofitting buildings across the member states. So that's called as part of the new Green Deal that they have in Europe. And that's significant. So it just shows you that without the building sector, we will not achieve our climate change goals. It's impossible. So there's a realization now. There's now investment in terms of policy and grant and funding programs and regulations. But we still have a ways to go, because in Canada we have, like the last count, we have about 250,000 buildings and millions and millions of homes that need to operate a lot better than they are right now.
Now, Thomas, wondering if you can expand on these next questions. Can green buildings become an economic driver? Can green buildings stimulate growth in the green building sector? And lastly, how can a green recovery that prioritizes green buildings accelerate the post-COVID-19 economic rebound?
All very good questions that I can answer, and I have actually some figures for you, because we did just that. We actually did last year we released a green building report that we did. It was for the second time, and it's called the Canada's Green Building Engine. And it talks about the critical decade ahead leading up to 2030, but it also talks about the economic recovery. Just to give you a sense, Dan, is that in 2014, we had close to 300,000 full-time employees in the green building industry. So these were individuals that worked on green buildings in Canada. In the 4 years after that, so by 2018, this had increased by 55%. And it was with very little or just a bit of government intervention. So 55. Those numbers of jobs actually exceed the jobs that you have in forestry and logging, in oil and gas, mining, and some of the support activities that support the oil and gas industry. Because they had by 2018 about 260 to 263,000 jobs versus the 460,000 jobs in the green building industry. I just wanted to point it out because people always get the idea that this is one of our biggest employers, when in fact the green building industry employs a lot of people. Now, we estimated that if we continue with business as usual by 2030, so without intervention, you just leave it by our own devices, by 2030 we'll have about 940,000 direct green building jobs, and close to 95 billion in direct GDP from the green building industry. And we would eliminate 22.5 million tons of CO2 in Canada. If the government were to invest, and we have seen some of the investment, this can be aggregated up quite significantly. If the government were to invest a significant amount of money, which we're seeing now, these green building jobs would go up to about 1.41 million jobs. And the carbon reduction could more than double, close to just about 50 million tons. Now, that's significant in terms of just economic growth. And what plays into that is also that you create not just jobs, but you also create skilled jobs. And you create also jobs as an opportunity, skilled jobs across the board, in particular in the trades. Canada's building industry is actually losing jobs even before the pandemic due to retirement. And this is a real opportunity to bring new people into the industry, young professionals into the industry, in skilled jobs, because constructing and building low carbon, zero carbon buildings requires an enhanced skill set that we currently don't have across the board. It also provides an opportunity to be more inclusive and more diverse in our workforce, bring parts of our society into this workforce that currently does not participate in an active way. Includes women. Construction industry is notorious for not having broad employment of women or underrepresented communities. So it's a real opportunity, but it's really an opportunity to grow the economy, because I think post-pandemic, I think it would be unfortunate that we would go back to the business as usual. I think it's a real opportunity to pivot and to be ambitious and say, what is the Canada that we actually want? What do we want our buildings, what we want our neighborhoods, what do we want our cities to look like? In terms of carbon, in terms of livability, in terms of environmental footprint, in terms of our economy. And this is the real opportunity for government to invest, because we know now that when money is needed, it can be made available to invest in something. We have learned this from the pandemic. When there's the climate crisis, I'm an optimist, but you often hear the climate crisis, it will be way worse than anything that happened under COVID-19. And the likelihood is very high that that will be the case. But we have an opportunity to change course. And if we change course, we have to do it now. We can't wait another 10 years. If we don't get to our 2030 goals, we certainly will not get to our 2050 goals. So we really have to have all hands on deck and move the needle forward. And in that thing, in the course of that, grow our economy and develop new jobs that are in the jobs in a low carbon economy.
Now, let's bring out your crystal ball and set the dial to 2030. And the question is as follows. How much difference will building be making to our progress to net zero goals?
Well, I think that if I look to by 2030, what would I want to have accomplished? I would think by 2030, I would want all new buildings over a certain size, let's say 25,000 square feet, to build zero carbon performance. We can already do that now. We already have 25 buildings in Canada that are zero carbon certified. There are another 50 plus in the pipeline. So we really can do that now. So that's one. The other one is I would want the large building retrofit at scale. We estimated, and I don't say that that's a firm number. And you talk to economists and everybody has their own numbers, but they're all relatively close. But you have to look at it that over the next 10 years, we probably have to retrofit anywhere between 50 and 60,000 buildings over 25,000 square feet to be 20 to 40% more carbon efficient after the retrofit than they are now. So that's a big number. It's a big number, but it's not insurmountable. And then the third one is what I would really like to see is have the workforce build up, have a more diverse and a more workforce in the building industry that's more representative of Canada. And I think that would be really something really a very desirable goal. And also to expand buildings, not just to, green buildings are a little bit the perception, and I think it's not deserved, but it's mainly in the urban centers and so on. I think with the announcement of the program by the federal government to also represent small and underserved communities, I would like to see buildings, green buildings all over the country. I like to see green buildings in neighborhoods that are considered to be on the low income side. Because I think in my books, I think the people that are the least able financially should actually have the greenest buildings. They should be the buildings that are the healthiest, and they should have buildings that cost them less to operate or to rent or to live in than any other demographic in Canada. So I think that expanding that concept, and you know what? There are already plenty of affordable housing projects that have been built to LEED. There have been schools that are built to zero carbon. It's not like that, but I think it goes back to scale. So in 10 years from now, I think I would just like green buildings everywhere, not just in the big urban regions in Canada, but everywhere. And this is really the challenge. And it becomes not just, it's a green building, something different. It just becomes a part of fabric of our lives that, yes, we have high expectations from our buildings when it comes to environmental and health performance.
Interesting. Now, let's keep on looking into the future here. What are some of the emerging technologies, innovations that hold much promise for the future of energy efficient and net zero homes? What's exciting you right now about this industry?
What's exciting me about the industry is that there continues to be a movement forward, because the building sector is always considered to be very traditional and slow moving, but it's actually the green building sector that is moving forward now very, very quickly, with big companies being at the table, making decisions around the quality and just the scale of what they want to do with their buildings that they own or control. So I think I'm very excited about that, and just the technology and innovation. In terms of new technology, I think that overall for carbon emission reduction, we do see a lot of technology coming up now around, that are connected to electrification of buildings. That buildings need to be electrified, and that within that context, you always see, more highly insulated buildings. You see buildings that are either have at least part of the renewable energy on site, but also in Canada, we have the advantage of taking advantage of our green electricity in many parts of the country. And in that regard, heat pumps often come, to the forefront as a technology that is having its day now and in the future. Of course, it's still more expensive than traditional way of heating and cooling buildings. But there's that opportunity, and I'm also a big fan generally of geothermal, like generally geo-exchange system, geothermal systems, as a way to maybe not on a single family home, but on community development. So I think the district aspect of what we're doing, I think, is really important too. That how we look at that, because despite the pandemic, there's a lot of building going on in Canada, and there are big projects that are being planned. I mean, in Ottawa, you have CB, you have the National Capital Commission is developing this piece of land, La Breton, France, where there are very ambitious targets. And in Toronto and in Mississauga and all over the country, here in Vancouver, we have big developments going in south of the Broad Street Bridge. One on native land, indigenous land. They're very ambitious in how they think about what these communities could be and housing thousands and thousands of people. So, and these are district systems. I think we need to, it's good to think about building by building, but we also need to think about more neighborhood and community scale. And how do you transform entire communities to be low carbon performance, right? And so district systems definitely come into play here. And district systems that, of course, either on renewable energy or are connected to our clean energy grid. And we see 95% carbon free. Ontario has a clean grid, Quebec, and Alberta has plans too to get off, coal-based electricity. So it's all going in the right direction.
Acting as a voice of the green building industry, your organization has been advocating for green building policy with all levels of government and the private sector across Canada. Have your efforts impacted green building standards?
Yes, it absolutely has, because when we the rating systems in Canada that we're using are voluntary, so they're not in code per se. They're done by the owners voluntarily, and our rating systems reference best available standards. So they're not just, written on the base of a napkin. This is a very solid, very credible, based on very credible standards. But they often, many instances, go beyond the code. And what that does is, in the past, and we continue to do that with our zero carbon buildings, it actually shows those that are in charge of developing the code that these buildings can be built now at a reasonable cost. And that's very important, because in bringing it down to a reasonable cost is necessary so that the code officials can say, we can take that step now because everybody in the industry can do it now at a reasonable cost, because the know-how is available, the products are available, the technology is available. So they can probably, and we have been told that in the past, that they were able to take the code further based on the voluntary action that the industry has taken that it could have done otherwise. And that's a really important role for the council as well, to continue to push the envelope, to push it forward to what's doable. And we've been very successful at that over the last, since 2004. And so that's a really important role. But the regulations at the same time also have become more ambitious. So we look particularly at cities, like City of Toronto, City of Vancouver. They have brought in more ambitious codes on what they would like, how to regulate new buildings. And now they are also they have started to also look at the existing buildings. And the federal government is planning also to develop a retrofit code, which would be the first of its kind in Canada, to really start addressing building retrofit. So again, through our work, we hope to continue to inform codes and what's possible from a kind of a market perspective. And then also what's possible from a technical and a technology perspective as well. So we see that as our role. We're kind of we're breaking new paths when it comes to buildings, And we have members and stakeholders that are very committed to this idea, to this mission, and they use their skills to make that happen. So that's one of the core roles that we have, and we kind of codify that then to our own standards. They make sure it's done right, and it's measurable, and you can report out on it, and it's transparent. It's very important to us.
Now, let's deep dive and maybe even explore some of the key market trends and drivers that are enabling and accelerating Canada's shift to high efficiency, zero emission buildings. And how could these impact Canada's green building industry?
Now, the big shifts are clearly the recognition of climate risk by the private sector, which is also addressed in what they call ESG, environmental, social, and governance frameworks. And also expressed, as we talked earlier, about sustainable investment, sustainable finance. Mark Carney is one of the big players in this globally when it comes to financial disclosures, addressing climate risk, but also sustainable finance. So this is a big trend. This means the private sector is stepping up and coming to the table. They're investing in things that actually mitigate carbon or eliminate carbon or reduce climate risk altogether. The second one is, of course, that the policy around carbon. We heard a couple of weeks ago that our targets are moving up now to more 40-45% by 2030, being consistent with the United States and being consistent with the global emergence of what the carbon target should be. Timing matters, right? It's climate change, particularly in Canada and particularly North, accelerating faster than we thought. So acceleration requires more focused and more targeted action. The third piece of that is, of course, carbon pricing. Carbon pricing, as it leaves it up to the business sector and everyone else to decide how they want to reduce the carbon, is a very effective mechanism to achieve carbon reduction across the economy. Even the carbon price of $50 is a step in the right direction, but we need actually the moving up to $150, $170 or potentially even higher over the next 10, 15 years is a very important aspect of driving the economy forward when it comes to carbon reduction. Because let's face it, there is a price on carbon that we're already paying in terms of infrastructure, in terms of human health. There's all kinds of impacts, and there needs to be a price on carbon to achieve that reduction. So it's the sustainable finance, it's the policy, it's the price on carbon, and then the other one, the big market trends too that play into carbon. How we started off our conversation today is this balance with health and wellness. Health and wellness has risen very much to the top, and Canadians, like most people who care about their health and well-being, we have a very high quality of life in Canada, and they care about health and well-being. And I think the green building agenda, the green buildings can actually help to enhance the health and well-being of Canadians while meeting the environmental aspects of that lie before us. When it comes to environment, we always focus on carbon, but there's so many. There's biodiversity, there is air pollution, there is water pollution, there is toxic substances in the environment. I mean, the list goes on and on.
I'd like to visit, or let's say revisit, what is the role of certifications and building codes? And do you feel they've raised the bar on energy efficiency, renewable energy, and sustainability practices?
Our green building standards certainly have done that. They have raised that considerably. And it's really up to the project owner, to the developer, to decide how far they want to go, but we have raised it considerably. The codes now are doing that as well. Probably One of the best examples being used quite often now is the BC step code, where they actually give some predictability in British Columbia when the code's requirement will increase. So the steps 1 to 5, they're currently at step 1, and then a certain year, then go to step 2, and so on up. So that the industry has a good line of sight what the expectations are with regards to increasing the building performance, environmental performance, and so on. So I think that's a really good tool. And generally, the codes, particularly at the local level, are getting more ambitious for those municipalities that can actually go beyond the provincial code. And federally, like I said, the codes are moving towards near net zero, and also there's also be a retrofit code. So there's movement there. The national code is always a bit challenging because it can be developed nationally together with the provinces, but then the provinces still have to adopt it. And that sometimes can take time, and sometimes can take years. Provinces can make modifications to the code. So if I can leave one message with the codes are moving up and being more ambitious, but at the same time, I think the pace of adoption matters a great deal, because the code is on a 5-year cycle. It takes you 5 years to update the code, and then you put it into the industry and the provinces have to adopt it. You can lose a lot of time till actually the first building is built to the code, so that the code development cycle and the implementation cycle, the adoption cycle, has to speed up. Because it can be sometimes can be a decade before the first building is built to a new code. And we don't have that time. In a decade, it's 2030. So I think that's something that really needs to speed up across the country.
Okay, let's have a bit of fun here. Thomas, how about you close us off with some rapid fire questions?
Okay.
Here's the first one. What is your favorite word?
Responsibility.
What is one thing you can't live without?
Trees.
Okay, that's cool. Okay, what is something that challenges you?
Status quo.
Now, if you could have one superpower, what would it be?
I would restore ecosystems globally.
Great response here. If you could turn back time and talk to your 18-year-old self, what would you tell him, Thomas?
I would tell him that, and it probably comes easy at that age, I would tell him to be non-conforming and that you can actually create a different future.
And lastly, what do you currently find most interesting in your sector?
I find it interesting that the building industry is viewed as very traditional, but there's a whole segment and a growing segment of the industry that's driving innovation now. So I think that's a big shift in an industry that's been changed in the past, at least changed very, very slowly.
Thomas, I hope you had fun. I had a blast. I'm sure our listeners will truly enjoy this interview. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. I truly hope you enjoyed this episode of the ThinkEnergy podcast. For past episodes, make sure you visit our website, hydroottawa.com/podcasts. Lastly, if you found value in this podcast, be sure to subscribe. Anyway, this podcast is a wrap. Cheers, everyone.